A cold, stormy night in London, and a man walks into Poirot's office, his face pale with fear. $1 million in Liberty bonds are stolen, and the prime suspect is him. But is he guilty? Or is someone playing a much darker game? The clock is ticking, and only one man can unravel the mystery: Hercule Poirot. The evening air in London was cold, with an unrelenting chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the city. Inside Hercule Poirot's office, the warmth of the fire barely softened the atmosphere, and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall punctuated the silence. A knock on the door. Poirot, sitting with his back to it, did not turn. His sharp senses were already aware of the man who had entered. He knew the type, the kind who carried an unease that could not be hidden. The sound of shoes on the wooden floor was deliberate, the steps measured but not quite steady. The door creaked open, and in walked Philip Ridgway, a man of obvious distinction, tall, broad-shouldered, but with a pallor to his face that spoke of sleepless nights. His eyes, tired but sharp, searched the room before resting on Poirot. "Monday due," Poirot murmured softly without turning his head. "You come, and yet you bring with you the weight of a troubling mystery, yes?" Ridgway's voice was strained when he spoke. "Monsieur Poirot, I am desperate. My fiancée Evelyn has begged me to seek your help." His gaze dropped to the floor, his hands clasping tightly at his side. "I am accused of a crime I did not commit." Poirot's small, neat figure remained still. His mind was already turning. "And what crime is this, M. Ridgway?" "Liberty bonds, $1 million worth, stolen under circumstances I cannot explain." Poirot's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Stolen, you say? And yet you are innocent." "Yes," Ridgway replied sharply, his voice rising with conviction. "I swear it. But they say I took them. I was entrusted with them. And now they are gone." Evelyn, who had followed quietly into the room, added, her voice trembling, "Monsieur Poirot, we must clear his name. I know Philip, he would never." Poirot raised a single finger to silence her. The woman's anxiety was clear, but he needed no further explanation from her. His eyes returned to Ridgway. His quiet, deliberate tone filled the room. "Monsieur Ridgway, I will take your case, but understand this: you have not simply come to me with a tale of robbery. You have come with a mystery that I, Hercule Poirot, shall unravel. And I promise you, mon ami, the truth will be revealed." There was a long pause. Ridgway nodded slowly, his face still wrought with worry, but a glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. Evelyn remained by his side, her anxious hands wringing together. Poirot rose from his chair, his figure small but composed, his mind already working. "This mystery, it is far from simple, but I am intrigued. I will need the details, of course, M. Ridgway, every one of them." He motioned to a chair. "Sit and tell me everything." Cliffhanger ending. As Ridgway began recounting his tale of the bonds entrusted to him, of the ship voyage across the Atlantic, of the tampered trunk, a shadow seemed to fall over Poirot's mind. Something was not quite right. His eyes lingered on Ridgway's every movement, studying the subtle clues in his mannerisms. Yet, as Poirot's mind raced with possibilities, the faintest sound, the softest creak of the door closing behind them, hinted at something far darker than even he could have anticipated. The game had begun. The investigation begins. Poirot sat across from Philip Ridgway, his gaze sharp, as the man began his account. Ridgway's voice trembled slightly, though he tried his best to maintain composure. His tale was one of both trust and betrayal, the kind that was not easily understood, much less believed. "Monday, sure. Please, go on," Poirot said quietly, his hand resting lightly on his cane. He had a way of prompting people to speak without ever appearing to rush them, a gift he had perfected over years of solving mysteries. Ridgway inhaled deeply before continuing. "It all began with my uncle, Mr. Vavasour, who entrusted me with the bonds. And then there was Mr. Shaw, the manager of the bank, who was equally involved in the arrangement. The bonds, valued at $1 million, were to be delivered safely from London to New York." He paused, the weight of the memory clearly heavy on him. "The night before I left London, everything seemed secure. The bonds were sealed in a leather case, placed carefully inside my trunk. I locked the trunk myself, Monsieur Poirot, and I remember the sound of the lock clicking shut. It gave me a sense of security, but oh, how mistaken I was. Poirot nodded, absorbing the details. There was something in Ridgway's voice, a slight hesitation that Poirot found curious. Not of guilt, but of something darker, something not yet revealed. He made a mental note to circle back to that. "Continue, mon ami," Poirot urged. Ridgway's eyes seemed distant for a moment, as though replaying the sequence of events in his mind. The ship set sail, and at first all was well. But 2 days out of port, I noticed something strange. My trunk, the locket, had been tampered with. I can't say how, but the metal was scratched, and the lock was no longer secure. I thought it a mere mishap, an unfortunate mistake. But when I opened it, he stopped, his breath shallow. The bonds were gone, disappeared, Monsieur Poirot, not a trace. Poirot leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And what of the ship? No one saw anything. No one came to your cabin?" Ridgway shook his head, his face pale. There was no sign of anyone entering, no footsteps in the hall, and the crew, they searched, of course. The captain, the officers, all of them looked, but nothing was found, no sign of the thief. It was as if the bonds had simply vanished into thin air. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his cane. "I see, and this brings us to New York, where the bonds were discovered. Nay, c'est pas." Ridgway nodded. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. A broker named Mr. Sutherland in New York claimed he had already purchased the bonds, but that is impossible. The ship had not even docked when the transaction was supposedly made. How could he have known?" A flicker of doubt crossed Ridgway's features. "I am not a criminal. I didn't do this, but I'm being accused wrongly. I swear it." Poirot remained silent for a moment, watching Ridgway closely. His mind, as always, was working, piecing together the details in that precise manner that only he could manage. Ridgway's story, so clear, so neat, seemed too neat, too simple. Poirot knew there was more. He had always known that the simplest explanation often held the deepest secrets. With a slight raise of his brow, Poirot spoke. "M. Ridgway, you are not the only one involved in this. Net, c'est pas. There is Mr. Shaw, of course, he who entrusted the bonds to you. And Mr. Vavasour, your uncle, who has, how do you say, a vested interest in the outcome of this affair." Ridgway stiffened at the mention of his uncle. "My uncle is a man of honor, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot speak for Mr. Shaw, but my uncle has always been trustworthy." Poirot didn't respond immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Yes, indeed. But tell me, M. Ridgway, when you first discovered the theft, did you not question the possibility of an inside job? Perhaps someone with more knowledge of the ship's layout, its crew, or, dare I say, someone with a keen interest in ensuring that these bonds did not reach their destination? The question hung in the air, heavy and charged with the implication that there was far more to this story than Ridgway could imagine. Poirot stood and began pacing slowly, his mind clearly turning over the facts as he absorbed them. "Do not be too quick to trust appearances, mon ami," Poirot murmured, "for there are many facets to this diamond of a case, and some of those facets are yet to reveal themselves." A silence settled over the room, and Ridgway looked at Poirot, his brow furrowed. He could feel the weight of Poirot's words, but he did not fully understand their meaning. What did Poirot suspect? Could he possibly know more than he was letting on? Poirot stopped pacing and turned toward the window, his back to Ridgway, as though lost in thought. "I will take on your case, Monsieur Ridgway. But understand this, there is much more to this mystery than a missing trunk of bonds. You are not the only one with secrets." A soft knock on the door broke the tension, and Poirot turned to face Ridgway once more. "We will begin, Monsieur Ridgway. The search for the truth begins now." Cliffhanger ending. As Ridgway stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of something strange, a fleeting movement in the reflection of the glass behind Poirot. A figure, cloaked in shadow, lingered just outside the door. Poirot did not seem to notice, but Ridgway's heart skipped a beat. Who was this person, and why had they been watching? Before he could ask, Poirot's voice broke the silence, calm and measured. "Ah, but I must ask you one last thing, Monsieur Ridgway. Did anyone else know about the bonds? Anyone else with a reason to ensure they did not reach New York?" The question lingered in the air like a challenge. Ridgway's mind raced, his thoughts turning over the past few days with increasing alarm. Could there have been someone he had trusted who had betrayed him? The suspects. The fog clung to the streets of London like a heavy blanket, a silent witness to the unfolding mystery. As Poirot and Captain Hastings stood in the dimly lit room of the old creaking house, the weight of the investigation was pressing down on them. Poirot's keen mind was already racing through the facts, piecing together the strange puzzle that had come into their lives with the disappearance of the bonds. But this was only the beginning. There were many more secrets to uncover. "Now, mon ami, we begin to search for the truth," Poirot said, his voice calm but filled with that unmistakable air of certainty. His eyes twinkled as if he already knew more than he was willing to reveal. "The first task, Hastings, is to look at the people closest to Monsieur Ridgway. These are the ones who may hold the answers or perhaps the key to the lies." Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, nodded eagerly. "I've been thinking, Poirot. Ridgway certainly seems desperate, but there's something about him, something that doesn't add up. But then again, it's hard to imagine him being involved in something so devious, isn't it?" Poirot's gaze sharpened as he looked at his friend. "Ah, Hastings, this is what we must remember. Desperation can make a man do strange things, and sometimes the appearance of innocence hides the most cunning of minds. But I do not yet accuse him. No, we shall proceed carefully." They first decided to visit Mr. Shaw, the bank manager. Shaw was an unassuming man, his frail health betraying his position. He had only recently recovered from a long and debilitating illness, and the strain showed on his face. He sat in a large leather-bound chair in his office, a cloud of sadness and fatigue hanging over him as Poirot and Hastings approached. "You have been ill, monsieur," Poirot remarked, observing Shaw with an appraising eye. Shaw sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as he leaned back in his chair. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, but I am well now, or so I believe. It was a long battle with illness, and I had hoped that it would be over once I returned to my work. But alas, here I am embroiled in this unfortunate matter." Poirot studied him for a moment, his gaze never leaving Shaw's tired eyes. "And you, Monsieur Shaw, you were the one who helped M. Ridgway with the bonds. Can you tell me about them? How they came to be in his possession?" Shaw hesitated, but only for a moment. I entrusted the bonds to Mr. Ridgway myself. They were to be delivered to Mr. Vavasour in New York. But I don't understand what went wrong. I cannot make sense of it." His voice cracked, a thin veneer of emotion breaking through. But Poirot, ever observant, noticed something else: a subtle twitch of Shaw's fingers, a nervous glance toward the window. "Tell me," Poirot said softly, "why did you not entrust the bonds to someone else, perhaps a more trustworthy courier? Someone not so personally involved?" Shaw flinched at the question, a flicker of discomfort passing over his face. "It was my choice," he replied quickly. "I trusted Ridgway, and I was eager to see the matter settled quickly. I did not think to suspect him. He seemed honest. But there was something in his voice, a quiver that suggested more was hidden beneath the surface." Poirot nodded, his thoughts already spinning. "Thank you, M. Shaw," he said quietly. "We shall leave you to rest." As they left Shaw's office, Hastings spoke first. "You think Shaw knows more than he's letting on, don't you?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "Indeed, mon ami, there is something he is hiding. But it is not yet clear what that is. We shall see." Next, they visited Mr. Vavasour, the uncle, a man of imposing stature. Vavasour exuded an air of quiet authority. He had that look about him, the look of a man who had seen it all, a man who had lived through many battles, both financial and personal. But there was something unsettling about him. Perhaps it was his cold, calculating eyes, or the way he carefully measured every word he spoke. "You come on behalf of my nephew, I assume?" Vavasour asked, his voice a rich baritone, smooth but cold. "Yes, Monsieur Vavasour. Poirot replied. "It is a matter that concerns the bonds entrusted to your nephew, a situation that, I believe, you may be involved in." Vavasor's gaze never wavered, though there was a brief tightening of his jaw. "I am involved in many things, Monsieur Poirot, but I do not see how this theft could concern me." Poirot watched him carefully, his mind working at full speed. "But your involvement with Mr. Shire connection to the bank must be close. Do you not have a vested interest in ensuring that the bonds are delivered safely?" Vavasor smiled, a thin, tight-lipped smile. "Naturally I do. But I assure you, I am as baffled as anyone as to how these bonds went missing." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And yet your nephew, Monsieur Ridgway, is the one who bears the brunt of this scandal. The question, Monsieur Vavasour, is not whether you care about the bonds, but whether you care about your nephew." Vavasor's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a brief shadow of doubt crossing his face. But he quickly regained his composure. "I care for my family, Monsieur Poirot, but I am not responsible for the actions of others." Poirot and Hastings exchanged a brief glance as they left Vavasor's home. "Monday, Ami," Poirot murmured. "It seems that everyone in this case has something to hide. Ridgway may not be the only one with secrets." As they walked toward the exit, Poirot's mind churned with possibilities, each twist of the case leading him deeper into a labyrinth of lies. There was one final question that lingered: was there someone else, someone hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings? Poirot's suspicions deepened with each passing moment. Cliffhanger ending. As they exited the house, Poirot's eyes fell upon a man standing at the edge of the street, watching them with an almost unnatural stillness. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, but Poirot could see enough to know that this man was not one of the usual townsfolk. He was a stranger, and the way he stood there so deliberately, so quietly, was unsettling. Poirot turned to Hastings, his face unreadable. "Hastings, do you see him?" Hastings looked, but by the time his gaze reached the spot, the man had disappeared into the mist, leaving behind only an eerie silence. "Who was that, Poirot?" Hastings asked, his voice low. Poirot did not answer immediately, his sharp mind working through the possibilities. "I do not know yet, but we shall find out soon enough." The midpoint. The morning fog had barely begun to lift as Poirot and Captain Hastings arrived in Liverpool. The docks were bustling with activity, the sound of creaking ships and the cries of dock workers filling the air. But for Poirot, there was only one focus: the ship that had returned from New York, carrying with it more than just cargo. It carried the key to the mystery that had been growing darker by the day. As they made their way through the labyrinth of warehouses and ships, Hastings couldn't help but glance nervously at Poirot. His friend's silence had grown more profound in recent hours, and the closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more Poirot seemed lost in thought. There was a sharpness to his eyes now, as though he was already several steps ahead. "I have a feeling, Hastings," Poirot muttered under his breath, "that the answers we seek are not on the surface. No, they lie hidden in the shadows." Hastings looked puzzled. "But Poirot, we've already questioned everyone involved. Ridgway, Shaw, Vavasour. What more could there be?" Poirot paused, his gaze shifting to the massive ship docked in the distance. He studied it, as if the very timbers of the vessel might hold the answers to the puzzle. "Sometimes, Hastings," Poirot said slowly, "one must look where the light does not reach. A small detail, a whisper in the wind, can speak volumes." Upon boarding the ship, Poirot and Hastings met with the stewards who had served on the vessel. The stewards, weary from their own duties, were all too willing to share what little they knew. They led Poirot and Hastings down the narrow hallways of the ship, their voices echoing in the otherwise quiet space. One steward, an older man with a thin face and tremulous hands, hesitated before speaking. "It was strange, sir," he said, casting a furtive glance down the hallway. "Mr. Ridgway, he was always so punctual, so precise. But it wasn't him that caught my attention, no. It was the man in the cabin next to him. An elderly invalid, Mr. Shaw. He barely left his room the entire voyage." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. This was new information, vital even. Shaw had been the man with the mysterious illness, the one who had been so central to the investigation. But what connection could he possibly have to the missing bonds? Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the details with the precision of a master at work. The steward continued. Mr. Shaw, he had his meals brought to him, and rarely did he speak to anyone. But one night, I saw him standing by the window, staring out over the ocean, as though he were waiting for something. I never thought much of it at the time, but now, well, I can't help but think there was more going on. Poirot's gaze sharpened. This was a clue he couldn't ignore. Why had Shaw, a frail man, been so strangely active? What had he been waiting for? And why was he so close to Ridgway, yet not part of the investigation? Tell me, monsieur, Poirot asked, turning to the steward. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Shaw's cabin? Any irregularities? The steward shifted uncomfortably, but eventually nodded. The lock on the door, sir. It was always fastened tightly. But I swear, the night before the ship docked in New York, it was slightly ajar. Just a crack. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now, I wonder. Poirot's pulse quickened. It was a small detail, easily dismissed, but in Poirot's world, nothing was too small to be overlooked. The elderly invalid, the cracked door, the strange behavior, it all pointed to something more. But what? What was Shaw hiding? They made their way to Shaw's cabin, and as Poirot examined the room with his usual meticulousness, a chill crept over him. The air was stale, as if the room had been locked for far too long. But it wasn't just the room that felt suffocating, it was the silence. No personal items, no traces of the man who supposedly occupied the cabin. It was as if Shaw had never been here at all. Poirot's mind worked rapidly, the gears turning faster and faster, until the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Ridgway, the missing bonds, Shaw, the story they had been told, didn't match the facts. There was something far darker at play, something that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Turning to Hastings, Poirot spoke in a low voice, his words thick with an unsettling calm. This is not about Ridgway, Hastings. No, this is much deeper. It is not the innocent man who hides the secrets, but the one we least suspect. We have been looking in the wrong direction all along. It is not the innocent man who hides the secrets, but the one we least suspect. We have been looking in the wrong direction all along. Hastings blinked in confusion. But Poirot, what are you saying? Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the window and stared out into the mist, the thoughts racing through his mind like the tide crashing against the rocks below. It is Shaw, Poirot whispered, almost to himself. The answer lies with Shaw, but he is not what he seems. He has been playing us all for fools. Hastings' eyes widened in realization, but before he could speak, a figure appeared in the doorway, a man. Tall, imposing, and dressed in black. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but there was no mistaking the cold gleam in his eyes. He had been waiting for them. Poirot's gaze locked with the man's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. You've been following us, Poirot said flatly. And now, you've finally shown yourself. The man didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, blocking their only exit. The tension in the room was palpable. Poirot's every instinct told him that this was the moment that would either lead to the truth or plunge them deeper into the web of deceit. With a calmness that belied the danger they faced, Poirot spoke again, his voice low but steady. What do you know, monsieur? And how much are you willing to reveal before it's too late? Cliffhanger ending. The man's lips curled into a grim smile, but he remained silent, his eyes filled with an unreadable intensity. Poirot's hand twitched slightly, his mind calculating the next move. But before he could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the cabin. Heavy, hurried footsteps. Poirot's heart raced as the door behind them began to creak open, and the figure of a woman emerged, her face hidden behind a veil, her steps deliberate, each one calculated as she moved toward them. It was the last person they expected. The room fell into a stunned silence. The woman's voice rang out, cold and clear, cutting through the tension. You've been looking in the wrong place, Monsieur Poirot. the game is far from over. Poirot's eyes flicked between the man and the woman, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her shadow falling over the two men, and whispered, "I am the key, and you have only just begun to understand." The door slammed shut behind her. The final act. The wind had turned colder by the time Poirot and Hastings stood in Shaw's study, staring at the clutter of papers on the desk. The case had led them to this moment, this final confrontation where all the pieces seemed to fit into place, and yet the answer still felt elusive, as though something remained just out of reach. Poirot was quiet, his hands folded neatly before him as he studied the documents. His eyes, sharp as ever, flicked between the papers, searching for the last clue. It had been a long journey to this point, weeks of questioning, of digging into the pasts of everyone involved. But there was no denying the truth now. Shaw, the frail invalid who had seemed like an afterthought in the case, was not the helpless man he appeared to be. "Shaw was never the victim, Hastings," Poirot said softly, his voice steady but filled with a cold clarity. "He was the mastermind." Hastings, who had been standing quietly at the window, turned sharply. But Poirot, how could he have orchestrated all of this? He was too weak, too frail. Poirot turned his piercing gaze on Hastings, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You see, Hastings, that is exactly the point. He wanted us to think he was weak. He wanted us to overlook him." Poirot paused, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. But Shaw had a plan so intricate that only someone with patience and an eye for detail could pull it off. Hastings stepped closer, his curiosity piqued, the words hanging in the air. What exactly did Shaw do? Poirot motioned to the pile of documents. It was simple, really. The bonds were never in that packet Ridgway was carrying. No, that was a decoy. Shaw had prepared a dummy packet to hand over to Ridgway. The real bonds were sent on a faster ship, one that would arrive in New York well before Ridgway's vessel even docked. Hastings felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the depth of the deception. But how did Shaw know the ship's schedule? How did he have the connections to get the bonds on a separate ship? Poirot's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. Shaw had an accomplice, Hastings. Someone in New York, ready to take those bonds before the ship even docked. The timing was flawless, and it was all part of Shaw's careful planning. Hastings stepped back, his mind spinning. But how did Shaw get into Ridgway's cabin? The locks were secure, and Ridgway swore he never left the room. Poirot nodded slowly. "Ah, that's where Shaw's cunning comes into play. You see, Shaw had a duplicate key, one made long before the ship ever set sail. With that key, he entered Ridgway's cabin, stole the dummy packet, and disposed of it by throwing it overboard into the sea. No one would ever find it, no trace left behind." Hastings was silent, his mind trying to comprehend the depth of Shaw's deception. It was all starting to make sense, the meticulous planning, the fake illness, the timing. But there was one final question hanging in the air, one that Poirot had not yet answered. "But Poirot, why?" Hastings asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and growing realization. "Why go to all this trouble? What did Shaw stand to gain?" Poirot's expression hardened. "That, my dear Hastings, is the most unsettling part of this entire case. Shaw had more to lose than we ever imagined. You see, his involvement in this heist was just the surface of a much darker plot." Hastings felt his stomach twist. He had always trusted Poirot's instincts, but now, with the full scope of Shaw's betrayal laid bare, it was impossible to ignore the cold feeling creeping up his spine. Something more sinister was afoot. Just as Poirot opened his mouth to explain further, the door to Shaw's study creaked open. Both men turned sharply, their eyes widening in shock. A figure stepped inside a figure neither of them had expected to see again. It was Mr. Vavasour, Ridgway's uncle. His eyes were dark, filled with a cold, calculating intensity. He held something in his hand, an envelope, sealed tight. But it wasn't the envelope that caught their attention. It was the look on his face, a look that said he knew exactly what was coming. Vavasour took a slow step forward, his voice cold and deliberate. "I see you've unraveled Shaw's little game. But you've missed something, Poirot. Something important." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. "And what, pray, is that, Monsieur Vavasour?" Vavasour's lips twisted into a cruel smile, and he tossed the envelope onto the desk. This is the final piece of the puzzle." Poirot reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. He tore it open, his heart pounding in his chest as he unfolded the single piece of paper inside. The message was short, but its implications were enough to send a shiver down his spine. The handwriting was unmistakable, and the words, stark and chilling, burned into his mind. "The game is far from over, Hercule Poirot. What you've uncovered is just the beginning, and the true mastermind is much closer than you think." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he slowly raised his gaze to meet Vavasour's. You knew all along," Poirot whispered, his voice low but filled with realization. "You were part of this scheme, weren't you?" Vavasour's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You think you've solved the puzzle, Poirot, but you're wrong. Shaw was merely a pawn, and now you've made a fatal mistake. The real mastermind is someone you've trusted." Hastings took a step back, his heart racing. "What do you mean, Poirot?" he asked, his voice filled with dread. Poirot stood still, his mind whirling. His thoughts raced, trying to put together the final pieces. The puzzle was larger than he had ever imagined, and someone he had trusted, someone in this very room, was pulling the strings. As Vavasour turned to leave, he cast one final glance over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the thick tension. "Enjoy the rest of your investigation, Poirot. It will be your last." The door slammed shut behind him. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot and Hastings were left in stunned silence, the weight of Vavasour's words hanging heavy in the air. The true mastermind was still out there, someone close to them, someone they had never suspected. But who? Poirot turned back to the envelope, his mind reeling. He had been wrong about everything. All the pieces he thought he understood, the patterns he had carefully pieced together, they were nothing but a smokescreen. The real game was just beginning. And the clock was ticking. The climax. The air in Poirot's office was thick with tension as he paced back and forth, his mind racing with the final critical pieces of the puzzle. The moment had come, the culmination of weeks of work, of endless hours spent untangling lies, half-truths, and misleading clues. He had always prided himself on his ability to see the truth where others saw only confusion, but even he had been shaken by the complexity of this case. Hastings stood by the window, his fingers anxiously drumming against the glass as he watched Poirot's every move. "You've cracked it, Poirot, haven't you?" he asked, his voice laced with both awe and trepidation. Poirot's gaze flickered toward his companion, his eyes gleaming with the cold certainty of a man who knew exactly what was coming. "Oui, mon ami. I have gathered all the pieces. The truth is at my fingertips. But now it is time for action." Poirot picked up the telephone and dialed Scotland Yard with deliberate precision, his fingers pressing each number with a sense of urgency. He spoke in a low, composed voice, issuing instructions that would send a team of officers to Shaw's estate. Shaw, the man they had once thought to be the victim, was now revealed as the mastermind behind the robbery. But Shaw's cunning was far from over. The criminal was still dangerously close. "Poirot, what if Shaw suspects something?" Hastings asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What if he runs before Scotland Yard can catch him?" Poirot's lips curled into a rare, tight-lipped smile. "It is not Shaw we should fear, Hastings. It is the consequences of what we have yet to uncover." The seconds stretched into eternity as Poirot listened to the officer on the other end of the line. His eyes never left the phone as he absorbed the details, a subtle flicker of concern passing across his face. Shaw had been preparing to flee, to escape with his ill-gotten gains. Time was running out. Suddenly, the door to Poirot's office swung open. A sharp knock had preceded it, and in the doorway stood none other than Ridgway, looking pale, anxious, and weary. He had heard the news she was exonerated, cleared of any involvement in the crime. Yet there was something in his eyes, something unspoken, as he stood there silently. "Ridgway," Poirot said, his voice calm but layered with an intensity that caught the man off guard. "I fear this case is far from over. There is something else, something you need to know." Ridgway's face twisted in confusion, but before he could speak, a sharp knock interrupted. Poirot's expression darkened, his lips tight as he gave Hastings a pointed look. "It is as I feared," he murmured, his mind racing. Outside the office, Poirot's instincts flared as he heard the hurried footsteps. In that moment, the door opened once more, and a figure shrouded in mystery slipped into the room. It was Shaw, but he was different now. His mask of innocence had fallen, replaced by a look of cold, calculating resolve. He was armed, his eyes flickering with a mixture of contempt and desperation. "I see you've figured it out, Poirot," Shaw said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "But I wonder, can you stop what's already in motion?" Poirot's gaze never wavered, but a cold resolve settled over him. "You are too late, Shaw," he said softly. "The truth is already known." Shaw smirked, glancing toward the window as though the very air outside would provide him with an escape. He took a slow step toward the door, but Poirot's next words stopped him dead in his tracks. "The bonds, Shaw. The ones you thought were lost. I know where they are." For a split second, Shaw's face betrayed him, his eyes narrowing as he turned, his hand resting almost imperceptibly on the inside of his jacket. "You think I don't know what you're playing at? You think Scotland Yard will stop me?" Before Shaw could make a move, Poirot's sharp voice cut through the tension. "They are already here. You will not escape this time." Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The door slammed open, and Scotland Yard officers poured into the room, their eyes focused on Shaw, who stood frozen in place. He knew the game was up. His carefully constructed plans, his lies, his deceptions, all of it had come to this. But just as Shaw's eyes flicked toward the door, a chilling realization washed over him. Someone was missing. Ridgway, the man he thought had been cleared, was still in the room, standing just behind Poirot. And in that brief, crucial moment, Ridgway's face shifted. A faint glimmer of recognition passed between him and Shaw. It was brief, but Poirot saw it, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to Ridgway. "No, it cannot be." But before Poirot could say another word, Ridgway stepped forward, his face a mask of cold, unfeeling calm. In a shocking twist, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming packet exactly like the one Shaw had sent with Ridgway at the beginning of the case. "The real bonds." "I'm afraid you've been misled, Poirot," Ridgway said, his voice ice-cold. "The mastermind was never Shaw. He was merely my pawn. I had planned this all along." The room went still, the realization crashing down like a thunderclap. Ridgway, the man they had trusted, had orchestrated the entire scheme from the very beginning. Shaw had been nothing more than a convenient tool to cover his tracks. The criminal mastermind, the one who had manipulated every, including Poirot, was the very man they had fought so hard to exonerate. Poirot's mind spun, but his face remained impassive. He had suspected, but now the truth was undeniable. Shaw had been the perfect distraction, a carefully constructed decoy. But Ridgway had always been in control. His cold eyes glinted with a sickening triumph. "You see, Poirot," Ridgway said with a mocking smile, "I've been 3 steps ahead of you all along. And now, it's time to end this game." The tension in the room was unbearable as the officers moved closer, ready to take action. But as Ridgway stepped back toward the window, the glint of the bonds still in his hand, a final, unexpected move occurred. A shot rang out. Cliffhanger ending. The room was plunged into chaos. Ridgway collapsed to the floor, the packet of bonds slipping from his hand. The truth had been revealed, but the cost was devastating. Poirot, shaking but resolute, quickly took control of the situation, his mind already spinning the next steps. Was Ridgway dead? Who had fired the shot? And more importantly, Who had orchestrated the entire scheme, Shaw or Ridgway? Poirot turned his gaze to Hastings, his expression hard and unreadable. "The game is not yet over," he whispered. "There is more to this than realize."